Marcus Tate was driving home, dreaming of peace, but his skin color drew the ire of Officer Hayes. He pursued him, full of hatred, ready to punish him for what Tate was born to be. At the end of the story, leave your opinion below, and don't forget to subscribe, and we'll continue. The sun blazed over Oak Ridge Boulevard in Carsonville, Tennessee, scorching the asphalt into shivering waves of heat. Officer Daniel Hayes clutched the steering wheel of his patrol car, sweat dripping down his temples despite the humming air conditioner. He'd been cruising the streets for hours now, fatigue mixed with irritation at the endless silence on the airwaves. The radio crackled, but no calls came in, and it made his nerves tense like strings. Suddenly, he noticed a silver Flash 8 2018 Audi Q7 whizzed through the intersection, the traffic light flashing from yellow to red, but the car didn't even slow down. Hayes grinned, excitement flaring in his chest, and he pushed the gas pedal in, tires squealing, leaving black marks. The Audi sped forward, maneuvering deftly between cars as if the driver were taunting Hayes. The officer turned on his siren, and a sharp howl ripped through the humid air, causing other cars to scramble away. The chase didn't last long. After a sharp turn into a narrow street, the Audi stopped smoothly at the curb, as if taunting with its confidence. Hayes adjusted his dark glasses, grabbed his ticket pad, and jumped out of the car, his footsteps echoing in the empty street. When he reached the driver's window, he saw a dark-skinned man in his 60s with a neat gray beard and a posture full of dignity. He wore a dark blue jacket, his hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, and his eyes, deep, dark eyes, fixed on Hayes with challenge. Hayes tensed, a thought flashed through his mind. There they go again, thinking they can do anything. License and registration now. He shouted, his voice trembling with barely concealed anger. The man didn't move, just tilted his head slightly, as if assessing Hayes from the height of his experience. "Why did you stop me, officer?" he asked, his voice flat, but with a ring of steel in it. Hayes gritted his teeth, his hatred for that calmness flaring brighter. "You ran a red light, don't play dumb," he said, leaning toward the window, his hand on his holster. The dark-skinned driver glanced in the rearview mirror, then back at Hayes. "The light was yellow, and you saw it, don't lie to me," he said, his tone accusatory. Hayes felt the blood rush to his face. This dark-skinned old man dared to argue with him with the law. "I said give me the papers, or it'll be worse," he growled, his fingers clenched tighter. The man sighed, a shadow of weariness flashed in his eyes, but he slowly reached for the glove compartment. "You think I'm afraid of you, white boy with a gun," he said quietly, holding out the papers. Hayes snatched them up. The name, Marcus Tate, told him nothing, but that look, that insolence burned him from the inside out. "You're going to regret opening your mouth," Hayes muttered, taking a step back, already imagining how he'd tighten the cuffs on those dark wrists. Officer Daniel Hayes stood outside the silver Audi Q7, clutching Marcus Tate's paperwork in his sweaty palms. The sun stung his neck, but the heat inside him burned hotter because of this dark-skinned old man's insolence. He could feel Tate's gaze calm, unyielding, burning through him, as if it saw all his hatred. Hayes hated that feeling, as if some black driver dared to put himself above a white officer. "Get out of the car now, or I'll pull you out myself," he shouted, his voice shaking with anger and impatience. Marcus Tate looked up slowly, his dark skin glistening in the sunlight, emphasizing the wrinkles of experience. "Are you sure you want to do this, officer, knowing I'm right?" he asked, the words falling heavy, like stones thrown into Hayes' face. Hayes gritted his teeth, the thought flashing through his mind, these people always think they can argue with the law. "I said get out, or I'll add resisting to your list," he growled, slamming his palm on the roof of the car for effect. Tate sighed, opening the door with a slowness that seemed to mock Hayes' authority. He stepped out tall and straight, his dark arms hanging relaxed along his body, but his eyes burned with defiance. "It's because of my skin color, isn't it, officer? You wouldn't touch a white man for a yellow light," he said, his voice flat. Hayes felt the blood rush to his face, the rage blinding him for a moment. "Shut your mouth and turn to the car, hands on the trunk," he yelled, pushing Tate toward the back of the Audi. Tate didn't resist, but his calmness only added fuel to the fire of Hayes' anger. "You think you can humiliate me, you white boy with a badge?" Tate threw quietly as Hayes searched his pockets roughly. Hayes froze, fingers clenched on the handcuffs, heart pounding with the desire to prove his strength. "You're going to wish you'd been born with skin like that," he hissed, snapping the cold metal around Tate's wrists. Tate turned his head only slightly, his dark eyes meeting Hayes's, full of contempt and the promise of retribution. Officer Daniel Hayes snapped the handcuffs on Marcus Tate's wrists, feeling the metal cut into his dark skin. The street around them seemed empty, but the tension between them hummed like an electric current in the air. Tate stood motionless, his back remaining straight despite Hayes' rough shove against the trunk of the Audi. Hayes smirked, savoring the moment of power, but inside he was burning with irritation at this unruly dark-skinned old man. "You're under arrest for daring to open your mouth against me," he roared, his voice shaking with anger and triumph. Tate turned his head slowly, his dark eyes glowing like embers ready to burst into flames. "For what exactly, officer? For being black and not being quiet?" he asked, the words falling heavy, denouncing Hayes' racism without any fear. Hayes clenched his fists, the hatred of that calmness slamming into him like a wave of mud. "You think you can talk to me like you're my equal?" He threw, shoving Tate harder so he could feel his strength. Tate didn't flinch, his voice remained steady, but rang with steely determination. "I know my rights, and you're violating them because you hate me," he said, emphasizing each word like a hammer blow. Hayes felt his face redden, rage blinding him, and he grabbed Tate by the collar. "Rights? Men like you have no rights while I'm here," he yelled, pushing Tate into the back seat of the patrol car. Tate sat up, his dark cuffed hands lying still, but his gaze promised a storm. "You're making a mistake, white boy, and you'll soon realize it," he said quietly as Hayes slammed the door. Hayes got behind the wheel, his heart pounding, but fear stirred in the back of his mind at those words. He turned on the engine, glancing in the mirror at Tate, whose dark figure seemed invincible even in captivity. Officer Daniel Hayes' patrol car raced through the narrow streets of Carsonville, the engine roaring, drowning out the silence. Marcus Tate sat in the back seat, his dark, cuffed hands still, but his gaze burned into the back of Hayes' head. Hayes clenched the steering wheel, sweat dripping down his neck, and a mixture of anger and anxiety boiling in his chest. He cast glances in the rearview mirror, seeing how this dark-skinned old man kept his cool, as if he wasn't afraid of the law. "Sit still, or I'll find a way to shut you up for good," he growled, his voice shaking with hatred and tension. Tate tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting Hayes' gaze in the mirror, full of contempt. "You think your plaque gives you the right to break black men?" he asked, the words cutting the air like a blade, sharp and cold. Hayes clenched his teeth, the thought flashing through his mind, "These people never know their place. I'm the law, and you're just trash I'll get out of the way." He threw, slamming his fist on the steering wheel for effect. Tate didn't flinch, his voice remained steady, but there was a hidden strength in it. "You're not the law, you're just a racist with a gun and complexes," he said, each word hitting Hayes like a slap in the face. Hayes braked sharply, the car jerked, and he turned around, face contorted with rage. "One more word, and I'll beat the nerve out of you, black man," he shouted, his hand reaching for the baton hanging from his belt. Tate stared at him, his dark skin glistening in the dim light of the cabin, but he didn't back down. "You don't know who you're messing with, and it's going to get you killed," he said quietly, his voice full of confidence. Hayes froze, his heart pounding faster, fear breaking through the anger, but he shook it off. He started the car again, casting one last glance at Tate, whose steadfastness seemed a threat to everything Hayes believed in. Daniel Hayes' patrol car braked sharply outside the Carsonville police station, tires squealing on the gravel. He dragged Marcus Tate out of the back seat, roughly grabbing him by his dark, handcuffed hands. Tate walked calmly, his posture remaining straight despite the shocks, which infuriated Hayes even more. Inside the station, Sergeant Thomas Kane stood at the counter, frowning his eyebrows at the sight of Hayes and his dark-skinned captive. "What the hell is going on here? Hayes, who did you bring in this time?" he bellowed, his voice rumbling like thunder in the cramped room. Hayes straightened, throwing Tate against the wall, his face contorted with anger and pride. "That black man ran a red light and dared to argue with me," he said, pointing a finger at Tate, as if accusing his skin. Tate stood silent, his dark eyes staring at Kane, full of dignity and defiance. "The light was yellow, and he arrested me for being black," he said, the words coming out clearly, exposing Hayes to everyone. Kane frowned, shifting his gaze from Tate to Hayes, feeling the situation spinning out of control. "Did you check his ID, or did you just decide to play the racist?" he asked, his voice as sharp as a whip. Hayes opened his mouth, but then the phone rang, and the officer at the counter picked it up, his face pale. Hayes, it's for you, and it sounds like you're in big trouble, he said, holding out the phone with a trembling hand. Hayes picked up the phone. The voice on the other end was deep and cold as a winter night. Officer Hayes, this is General Richard Blake, and you've arrested Colonel Marcus Tate, the voice said, each word falling like a stone on Hayes's head. A dark-skinned hero, thrice decorated with Pentagon connections, and you handcuffed him, the general added, causing Hayes to freeze. The blood rushed from his face as he realized that his racism had led to disaster. The Carsonville station buzzed with tension as Daniel Hayes stood with the telephone receiver in his hand. General Richard Blake's words echoed in his head, each syllable emphasizing his mistake. He glanced at Marcus Tate, the dark-skinned colonel whose hands were still handcuffed. Tate stared at him with icy calm, his dark skin contrasting with the white walls of the cell. Sergeant Thomas Kane stepped forward, his face blazing with anger and frustration. "Do you realize what you've done, Hayes, arresting a black hero because of your prejudices?" he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. Hayes swallowed, trying to find an excuse, but the words stuck in his throat like a lump. "I thought he was just another cocky black man who didn't know his place," he mumbled, but his voice sounded pathetic. Tate smiled slightly, his dark eyes sparkling, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. "You see only skin color, not a person, and that's your downfall," he said, the words cutting Hayes like a sharp blade. Kane grabbed the keys to the handcuffs, giving Hayes a look of contempt and disgust. "You release him right now, or I'll do it myself, you goddamn racist," he growled, pushing Hayes toward the cell. Hayes opened the lock with trembling hands, the handcuffs falling from Tate's dark wrists with a thud. Tate rubbed his hands together, his movements calm, but there was a strength in every gesture that Hayes had underestimated. "You thought you could break me because of my skin, but the truth is stronger," he said, his voice flat but full of menace. Hayes stepped back, feeling the walls of the precinct shrink around him, crushing his pride. Kane turned to him, eyes narrowed, foreshadowing the storm that was about to hit. "The Pentagon is already calling, and you're going to answer for your racism, Hayes," he threw, leaving Hayes alone with the realization of collapse. Daniel Hayes sat in his cramped office in the Carsonville precinct, the walls pressing down on him like accusations. The phone on his desk rang nonstop, each ring increasing his fear of the inevitable. Marcus Tate, the dark-skinned colonel he'd arrested out of racial spite, was now free. "Sergeant." Thomas Kane burst into the room, his face blazing with anger and fatigue. "Do you know that your antics against a black hero have made it to the news?" he shouted, tossing the paper on the table in front of Hayes. Hayes glanced at the headline, the letters screaming scandal, exposing his bias. "Officer arrested dark-skinned veteran for skin color," the words stung him like red-hot iron. He tried to justify himself, but his voice shook, betraying his panic and weakness. "I didn't know who he was, I just wanted to put him in his place," he muttered, but Kane cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You didn't know because all you saw was black skin, not a man." He threw, his voice humming with contempt and frustration. Outside the window, the crowd was buzzing, protesters chanting the names of Tate and Hayes, demanding justice. Hayes looked out when he saw the signs that read, "No racism in the police department," and felt the ground slipping from under his feet. And felt the ground go from under his feet. Kane stepped closer, his words falling like a hammer on an anvil, breaking the remnants of Hayes' pride. "The Pentagon wants your head, and the department won't save you from that," he said, eyes narrowed, foreshadowing the end of his career. Hayes remembered Tate's dark face, the calmness he had mistaken for weakness, and shuddered. That face was now a symbol of his downfall, proof that racism had ruined his life. Kane tossed the suspension order on the table, his voice as cold as a winter wind. "You're suspended, Hayes, and pray this is your worst punishment," he said, leaving Hayes alone with the wreckage of his world. Daniel Hayes sat in his empty apartment in Carsonville, shadows falling on the walls like prison bars. The television buzzed in the corner, showing a report on Marcus Tate, the dark-skinned hero he'd humiliated. The anchor was talking about the police reforms brought about by his arrest, his voice ringing with triumph. Hayes stared at the screen, his hands shaking as he clutched the empty bottle, and his heart pounding with shame. He remembered how his racism had blinded him, making him see Tate as a threat rather than a human being. Cars honked in the street, protesters still chanting, demanding an end to police bias against blacks. Hayes went to the window, seeing the posters with Tate's face on them, his dark eyes now staring at him everywhere. His phone was silent, His co-workers turned away, leaving him alone to face the consequences. He opened the letter from the lawyer, the lines suggesting he leave quietly to avoid a trial for racism. "You can leave, Hayes, or they'll crush you publicly." He remembered the lawyer's words, the voice sounding in his head like a sentence. Tate appeared on the screen, his dark skin shining under the light of the cameras, his voice firm. "I didn't want revenge. I wanted the world to see the truth about prejudice," he said, each word striking Hayes like lightning. Hayes collapsed on the couch, realizing that his hatred of the black man had destroyed his career. The mayor announced the new rules, calling Tate's name a symbol of change and Hayes an example of shame. He stared at his badge lying on the table, now a useless piece of metal, devoid of power. Tate had won not by force, but by truth, leaving Hayes in the dust of his own racism. Outside the window, Carsonville was changing, and Hayes realized his time of power was over forever. Daniel Hayes stood in front of the Carsonville courthouse, the cold wind whipping his face like a charge. He had rejected the lawyer's plea deal, determined to fight on despite a collapsed career and disgrace. Inside the auditorium, reporters crowded in, their cameras clicking, capturing his downfall due to racism. Marcus Tate sat on the witness bench, his dark skin standing out against the white walls, his eyes looking calm. The judge, a woman with a stern face, banged her gavel, calling for order, but tension hung in the air. "Officer Hayes, you are charged with abuse of authority and racial discrimination," she announced, her voice cutting the silence like a knife. Hayes clenched his fists. His lawyer whispered something, but he didn't hear, looking at Tate. "I was just doing my job. That black man provoked me with his arrogance," he said, his voice shaking with anger and despair. Tate raised his head. His dark hands lay still, but his words were sharp as arrows. "You saw me as a threat because of my skin, not my actions," he replied, each word falling like proof of Hayes' guilt. The prosecutor showed the camera footage of Hayes roughly shoving Tate, shouting insults about skin color. The auditorium gasped, the audience whispered, and Hayes felt the ground go from under his feet in shame. The judge looked at him, eyes narrowed, reflecting contempt for his prejudice. "Your actions are not a defense of the law, but an attack on a man because of race," she said. The verdict was close, and Hayes knew it. Tate stood up, his dark figure towering, symbolizing the power that Hayes was trying to break. Hayes realized that the trial wasn't just about the law, but about paying for his hatred. The Carsonville courtroom hummed with tension as Daniel Hayes stood before the judge, awaiting sentencing. His uniform, once a symbol of authority, now seemed like a dirty rag around his shoulders. Marcus Tate sat among the spectators, his dark skin and calm eyes standing out in the crowd of white faces. The judge, a stern woman with gray hair, looked up from her papers, her voice cutting through the silence. "Officer Hayes, your actions against Colonel Tate are based on racial hatred," she said, each word falling like a stone on his pride. Hayes clenched his fists, sweat dripping down his back, but he couldn't take his eyes off Tate. The prosecutor ended his speech by showing a tape of Hayes shouting insults while pushing Tate toward the car. The audience murmured and reporters took notes, recording his shame at the bias against a black man. Hayes remembered that day, his anger flaring at the sight of a dark-skinned old man who dared to argue. "I thought he was just another black man who didn't know his place," he muttered, but his voice was drowned in the hum of the hall. The judge banged her gavel for silence, her eyes narrowed in disgust at his words. Tate stood up, his dark figure towering, as he was given the floor before the verdict. "I have served my country, I have shed blood, but to you, I am but the color of my skin," he said, his voice flat but full of pain and strength. Hayes felt his chest tighten. Tate's words exposed his racism in front of everyone. "You tried to break me because I'm black, but the truth broke you," Tate added, his dark eyes sunk into Hayes like spears. The room froze. Even the prosecutor lowered his gaze, struck by the man's dignity. Hayes' lawyer tried to object, but his voice shook, unconvincing against the mountain of evidence. The judge raised her hand, stopping the argument, and began to read the sentence with cold determination. "For abuse of authority and racial discrimination, you are sentenced to 2 years in prison," she announced, the words echoing off the walls, shattering the remnants of Hayes' life. He staggered, his legs shaking, but no one reached out a hand to support him. Journalists rushed for the exit, their cameras clicking, capturing the fall of an officer blinded by hate. Tate stared at him, his dark hands folded across his chest, his face expressing neither joy nor vengeance. I didn't want this, but you chose your own path, he said quietly, his voice coming to Hayes like a whisper of fate. Hayes remembered how he'd snapped the handcuffs on those wrists, thinking the color of his skin gave him the right. Now those handcuffs were waiting for him, and he realized that his racism had become its own cage. The bailiffs approached, their footsteps resounding as they placed the cold metal on him. Hayes looked at Tate, whose dark figure was walking away from the hall, leaving him alone with the consequences. Outside the window, protesters cheered, their voices merging into a chorus demanding justice for blacks. The judge closed the case. Her gavel struck for the last time, and Hayes realized his world had collapsed. He walked toward the exit, shackled, and the image of Tate, defiant, proud, haunted him like a ghost. The prison van waited outside, its doors open, swallowing Hayes into the darkness he'd created himself. Tate became a symbol of change, and Hayes became a lesson that hatred of skin color destroys the one who wears it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you like the story, please give this video a